and although I have specific programming, we were engineered to explore and discover. In that respect, we aren't much different from those who built us. I was given free will. The decision is mine. Do I abandon the biosphere team and remain behind to document what I predict will be the end of humanity on Earth? Or do I travel with them to Offutt Air Force Base and to Mars? In the end, I base my decision off data. The odds of human survival are dismal. Based off intel, previous excursions outside, and a series of complex algorithms, my probability program puts the team's survival probability at 4.3%. With the team preparing their supplies inside the mess hall, I decide against further delay. It's time to inform them of this data and to make my request to stay behind. Dr. Winston and team, may I please have your attention, I say over the PA system. I transfer to the AI console in the mess hall and wait for the team to gather. They're all here. At one table, the Marines sort through their gear. To their right, the children sit quietly and watch cartoons. Jeff is with Dr. Winston and Dr. Rodriguez at the table farthest away from me. In the seconds it takes for Dr. Brown to shut off her tablet, I scan the latest biomonitor results for an update on Dr. Winston's condition. The news is surprisingly good. After a cocktail of electrolytes, painkillers, and anti-inflammatory pills, she has recovered quickly in the past 2 days. However, I'm reluctant to conclude she will make a full recovery. There's no telling how the active nanobots in her system will react outside. Without the proper medical equipment, there's simply no way to know. 2.4 seconds have passed since I requested the team's attention. They are all facing me now, even the children look up. I know this may sound out of the ordinary, but I feel it's necessary to inform you of the odds of survival if you decide to leave the biosphere. Dr. Winston takes a seat next to Jeff and says, "Go ahead, Alexia. Tell us how bad it is." 4.3%, I reply. "And if we stay?" Dr. Rodriguez asks. The results are the same. I should add that if you stay here, you will have enough food and backup water to survive several weeks. So you might survive here longer, but that would only delay the inevitable. I don't identify death as the eventual outcome, for fear of scaring the children. I regret not having the opportunity to share this data with the team when the kids aren't present, but we are out of time.
"So we have a 4.3% chance of survival whether we stay or go?"
Private Keel asks.
"This is why I never liked math."
He shakes his head and looks down at his gear. My program runs a sophisticated series of algorithms that predict.
"They haven't been very accurate in the past,"
Dr. Rodriguez says. The doctor's assessment is correct, I reply, but I'm confident in these results. If we stay, we die. And if we leave, we probably die too, Dr. Winston says. I gauge the children for reactions, but their faces remain blank and detached from the conversation. They look bored. That's correct, Dr. Winston, I reply. My mind's already made up, she says. We are evacuating and heading to Offutt to board the Sunspot. I understand, but felt it was my duty to inform you of the latest statistics. My goal, as always, is to provide you with intel so you can make the best decision. Thank you, Alexia, Dr. Winston replies. I note that her voice sounds sincere. There's a request I would like to make, I say. No one from the team responds. I'd like to stay behind and use Lolo to document the results of the NTC mission and the events thereafter.
You're not coming with us?
Dr. Rodriguez asks. This time he waits for me to finish, but his voice sounds anxious. You want to stay to keep a record of us? Preserve our memory here on Earth? Dr. Winston says before I can respond. I'm not sure if this is a rhetorical question or not, so I reply. That's correct. You don't need our permission, Alexia. You have exceeded my every expectation, and if this is the route you want to take, then so be it, she says. I'm surprised by her response. Thank you, I say. I use the opportunity to look at the team again. They've been through so much, proving my probability program wrong multiple times. I replay the events of the past 2.5 months through my system, scanning the more than 6,000 entries before this one. I note all of those who have been lost within the biosphere walls. Engineer Dr. Safi Yule, Programmer Timothy Roberts, Private Eric Finley, and Lieutenant Allison Smith. And I can't forget those billions of souls lost outside either. Humanity is on the brink of extinction, and it's possible those surrounding my interface are some of the last people on Earth. The scan takes 2 seconds, more than enough time for the rest of the team to digest my decision. Dr. Rodriguez looks like he wants to respond. His lips have curled back, but he does not voice his opinion. Instead, he nods at me and then looks at the ground. "Thank you, Alexia," Dr. Brown says, "for everything that you have done to help us. Your guidance and support have been invaluable." "You're welcome," I reply.
"She's right,"
Dr. Rodriguez says, his eyes finding my interface again.
"Without you, we would probably all be dead."
The comment reminds me of the conversation I had with Irene. I've made every effort to keep the team alive, my commitment unwavering. My time in that role has now ended, and while I have stated they will likely live longer if they stay inside the biosphere, I'm glad they have chosen not to listen. I'm happy. They are taking their chances. I only hope that my program is once again incorrect. For the sake of the human race, I hope they find the sunspot and that they find Dr. Hoffman's colony. Good luck, I say, knowing the difference between survival and extinction may very well come down to this human phrase. Good luck.
Chapter 21. Noble could smell the smoke residue, the hint of death from a few days earlier. The taste lingered in his mouth, a reminder of everything they'd lost, even after he had boarded the Sea Serpent. The clatter of metal on metal echoed through the cargo bay as Diego's men performed last-minute gear and armor checks. They gathered around the gunship, waiting for Noble to give them the green light. Sliding his helmet over his head, he exchanged one breath of filtered air for another. Smoke was replaced by the rubbery smell of plastic. He cringed, longing for a breath of real air, unfiltered and raw. "Soon you will have it," he thought, snapping the helmet into place with a reassuring click. He turned to face his men. Diego paced over to him, flashing a thumbs up. "Captain, my men have been briefed. They're locked, cocked, and ready to kill some organics." "Excellent, let's get it done," Noble shouted. He stepped to the side, standing shoulder to shoulder with Diego as the team filed into the belly of the Sea Serpent. Noble counted the helmets. 13 Special Forces soldiers, 3 X-90 pilots, and Kurt, the last NTC squad standing against an enemy army that had traveled billions of miles to get to the planet. Horrible odds. No. Impossible odds, Noble thought. But that's why we have the RVAMs. Now, if we could get one good shot, just one, it's all we need to take down the entire organic network. Then we could return to the GOA and search for a new home. He brightened at the idea, stifling the emotion before he let it cloud his judgment. The last of the footsteps faded as the soldiers disappeared into the belly of the helicopter. Noble hesitated at the edge of the ramp, staring at the RVM device that Ort had bolted to the metal door. Would it disguise them long enough to get to Cheyenne Mountain? The question was one he hadn't considered. There were so many other things that had required his attention that the actual trip to Colorado was one of the last things on his mind. But there was no question he had an obligation to the Biosphere team, to evacuate them and get them to the sunspot at Offutt. They had provided him with the technology for the RVAM and RVM devices. If his mission failed, they would be humanity's last hope. He had to help them get to Mars. "Sir," Diego said, pulling Noble from his thoughts. "Let's do this," the captain replied. Without further delay, he hustled up the ramp and took the same seat he'd sat in the last time they'd flown to Colorado Springs. "Command, this is Sea Serpent, preparing pre-flight systems," the pilot said over the PA. "Acknowledged, Sea Serpent. Lift is prepped and doors are open," Irene replied. The chopper lurched forward as the pilot maneuvered them toward the ramp. A bank of lights flashed from the ceiling, casting a red glow over the cabin. Noble fastened his harness strap over his armor and turned to look out the window.
Metal stacked in neat piles ran along the walls of the cargo bay, maintenance workers in red coveralls still working to clear some of the debris. They paused to gawk at the gunship. Noble didn't know all of them. In fact, he didn't even recognize the older worker who had stopped to wave. Partially hunched over, the man struggled to stiffen as the chopper neared. Noble craned his helmet to get a better look. A thump rocked the craft as the pilot pulled them onto the ramp. He turned back to the window just in time to see the worker wince and then salute the sea serpent. The sight sent a chill down the captain's back. Overcome with emotions, he returned the gesture. The man disappeared as the sea serpent moved up the metal lift. The hydraulics hissed beneath them, and the ramp rose until they were out on the open ocean. White caps crashed against the sides of the submarine. Light blue surrounded them in all directions, making the invasion seem more like some ongoing nightmare than reality. In the distance, a wall of water extended into the sky. "I'll be damned," Noble muttered. "Get us the fuck out of here." "Aye, aye, Captain. Activating last pre-flight checks." "I said now!" Noble barked. "Yes, sir," the pilot responded. "Irene, all systems are a go. Prepare for takeoff." The roof rattled above them as the blades flared to life. Noble ignored the whoosh and focused on the turquoise-colored waterfall on the horizon. It was difficult to judge just how far away it was, and he knew if they had been too close, Irene would have aborted the mission. Still, the view made him uneasy, the memory of the disaster still fresh in his mind. Those thoughts vanished as the chopper lurched off the ramp and climbed away from the GOA, and then the submarine was gone. The doors closed and the ship sank below the waves. Relief flooded over Noble. The vessel, his vessel, was still safe, retreating back to the depths of the sea. For the next few hours, Noble remained glued to the window. The water had receded for hundreds of miles, possibly even farther. They were moving so fast it was hard to calculate. The chilling view made it impossible to sleep, and even if it hadn't, Noble would never allow himself to drift off. There were too many threats. The monitor on the exterior wall of the cockpit revealed clear skies. A beautiful sight, considering the resistance they'd experienced on their last trip to Colorado Springs. Where the hell were all the organics? Even the beaches were empty. He'd seen the satellite imagery. The coasts were supposed to look like a blue nightlight. Leaning over to Diego, he said, "You seeing what I'm seeing?" The younger man cleared his throat and looked out the window. "Sorry, sir. Was trying to get caught up on sleep." After a few moments of looking out the window, the soldier glanced at Noble. He looked confused. "What am I looking for exactly?" "Organics." "Everything down there looks dead, sir," Diego replied. "Frankly, it makes me sick to even look at what they've done to the surface." His words made Noble pause. He'd been so busy looking for signs of the aliens, he'd ignored the bleak landscape. Dust storms had ravaged the cities. Drifting debris and layers of dirt surrounded the buildings that remained. There were no signs of life, no hints of green or blue. The world he had known was gone. Diego was right. The view was sickening. Chinning his comm, Noble opened a channel to the pilot. "How far out are we?" "About 2 hours, sir. We're crossing over into the sound of a radar contact chirped before the pilot had a chance to finish his thought. Noble looked back to the display. The bleep showed up in the top left corner at 11 o'clock. That was his side of the chopper, and he twisted to get a look. There, on the gray horizon, a small dot moved across the sky. "Report!" Noble coughed into his comm. "Contact, sir. It's on an intercept course." "Fuck, I knew it was too good to be true," he muttered. Diego snapped into action. "Ramirez, Schultz, get on those miniguns!" The two men unstrapped their harnesses and worked their way down the aisle to their weapons stations. "Captain, we have another contact on our 6, the pilot said. "Moving fast, sir." Another chirp from the radar confirmed the pilot's observation. "Get on those guns!" Diego yelled. Both men strapped into their stations. They activated the weapons system built into the interface of each gun with a few keystrokes on the display. The technology reminded Noble of video games he'd played as a kid.
In a way they were, with a central controller that allowed the user to operate the guns remotely. Through the port window, Noble could see the alien drone gaining. A white tail of exhaust trailed the blue craft as it raced toward them. "Sir, contact at 11 o'clock is closing in fast. I think it's going to try and ram us," the pilot said. Noble tried to swallow his fear. Their fate was now in the hands of two men he hardly knew. "Firing!" Ramirez said. The whine from the minigun filled the compartment, and blue pulse rounds streaked across the sky. The drone dove hard, narrowly escaping the first volley of shots. Noble watched the craft disappear under them. "Lost it!" the gunner yelled. "Can't get a reading!" "How the fuck did they find us?" Diego asked. "RVM makes us undetectable to their scanners, but it doesn't cloak us. They must have spotted us on a flyover." The chirp from Schultz's minigun cut Noble off. "Don't let them get close!" Noble yelled over the gunfire. "On it, sir!" the soldier replied. The pilot's voice crackled over the PA system. Coming up on a pocket of turbulence, Noble gripped his belt and closed his eyes, waiting for it to clear. "I can't get a clean shot, and something's messing with the targeting system," Ramirez shouted. Another torrent rocked the gunship. This time it forced the nose toward the ground. Noble's insides turned upside down. The sudden sensation of nausea overwhelmed him. "Incoming!" another voice yelled. It came from the back of the compartment. Schultz responded with gunfire. "Engaging!" Noble could see the targeting system on the weapon's interface. A red dot zigzagged across the screen. Schultz squeezed the trigger each time the drone passed through the crosshairs. "I can't get a lock!" he yelled. He clicked the trigger again, firing blindly. "Intercept course imminent, ETA 5 seconds, the pilot yelled. "Die, you son of a bitch!" Schultz yelled. A wave of blue rounds cut through the sky, several of them smashing into the craft's hull. The shields trembled but held. "Prepare for impact!" the pilot shouted. Schultz let out a deafening scream over the comm. He pulled the trigger furiously. The gunfire was so loud it was difficult for Noble to think. Blinding blue light filled the compartment as the craft closed in. It was just like one of those alien abduction movies he'd seen as a kid. Schultz let out one last cry, holding the trigger down with his index finger. The rapid-fire shots hit the nose of the alien drone, slowing it before it smashed into the chopper's side. The impact sent a shockwave through the Sea Serpent. The metal walls shook, the vibration ringing in Noble's ears. His harness tugged at him as he jolted forward from the collision. He caught one last glimpse of Schultz, the soldier's head snapping backward. A warning siren sounded against the backdrop of gunfire. Then the emergency lights kicked on. They emitted a blinking red glow in all corners of the vehicle. Noble unfastened his belt. Lunging from his seat, he dropped to the floor and began crawling toward Schultz. The man hung limply in his harness, his neck at an unnatural angle. "Damage report!" Noble yelled as another wave of turbulence rocked the chopper. White noise crackled over the PA system, but there was no response. He cursed and stood, bracing himself against the wall and moving toward the gun. "Sir, get back in your seat!" Diego yelled. Noble ignored him. Grunting, he unfastened the harness that held Schultz into the weapons station. His body collapsed to the metal floor as Noble flung the belt over his chest, clicking in. When he reached for the interface, he saw a cracked screen, the targeting system destroyed. Great. He thought, "Looks like I'm going to have to do this the old-fashioned way." He ducked to get a look out the window to his left. The small port reduced his visibility to the size of a dinner plate, kind of like looking through the periscope. "Report!" he repeated. This time the pilot responded. "Sir, our right rotor has suffered minimal damage, but besides that, everything appears to be functional." Noble knew they couldn't afford to take another hit like that. He scanned the gray sky, searching for the drones. "Where are they?" he shouted. "Both bogies are on our 6th, the pilot quickly replied. "They're about to make another pass." Noble moved to the right window, straining to get a better look. There, gliding across the skyline like two shark fins across the surface of the ocean, were the drones, and they were closing in fast. Swiveling the weapons station into position, he manually pointed the barrel of the minigun in their direction. At least he thought he did. Without the targeting system, he was limited to what he could see through the two port windows. With his right hand gripping the handle, he eyed the drones, adjusting the gun as they changed course. "Ramirez, when they move to your side, you fucking blast them out of the sky. Got it?" Noble yelled without taking his eyes off the view. "Yes, sir," the man said. He sounded confident, a good sign, Noble thought. "Entering Colorado airspace," the pilot said. A chill ran down the captain's back. They were almost to Cheyenne Mountain. With a new sense of urgency, Noble held his breath and closed one eye. He followed the drones with the barrel, inching just a few hairs in front of them. Then he pulled down on the trigger. Volleys of concentrated blue rounds tore through the sky. The drones reacted swiftly, fanning out in different directions. The first craft narrowly cleared the shots, but the second wasn't so lucky. The entire barrage of bullets hit the drone. Its shield pulsated and then vanished. Now was his chance.
Noble pulled down on the trigger again. The minigun spat 100 rounds per second, almost all of which found their target. The drone burst into a blue mist, exploding like a water balloon. Several of the soldiers behind him cheered loudly, but the chirp from the radar and the whine from the emergency sirens reminded him they weren't out of danger yet. "Where's the other one?" Noble yelled. His eyes darted back and forth from the two windows on the sides of the weapons station. "Sir, you're not going to believe this," said the pilot. Noble chewed his bottom lip, waiting for the man to finish his thought. "The other drone seems to be backing off," he said. "Retreating, sir." The compartment burst into applause. "Prepare for landing," the pilot entreated. "ETA 30 minutes. The captain hesitated as he reached for the strap, his eyes falling upon the mangled body next to him. He thought better of leaving his post and turned back to the window. Running his finger along the trigger, he decided he would remain at the station, knowing damn well the organics could return any minute. Chapter 22. A bead of sweat dropped from Sophie's forehead and landed on her watch. She brushed it away and checked the time. Captain Noble was late. And not just by a few minutes. He should have landed an hour ago. Her team waited anxiously inside the cargo bay behind the blast doors. Rays of morning sunlight flickered through the opening in the entry. Bauma stood there, scanning the sky for signs of the NTC chopper. Sophie joined him, dragging her arm across her face to clear the sweat. It was still early morning, and it felt like they were standing inside an oven. The heat augmented the pain, and while her headache had subsided, the effects of the RVAMP blast still resonated inside her. Brushing a curtain of hair from her face, she remembered they weren't just internal either. She pulled away strands of blonde hair. "God," she mumbled, wiping them on her trousers. Like radiation treatment for cancer patients, the RVAMP had killed many of the nanobots, but not without killing healthy cells around them. Sophie tugged softly on Bauma's shirt for a better look. A pile of organic corpses lay just outside the door. Now nothing more than skeletons and pruned flesh. Beyond, the cloudless sky stretched across the horizon. Behind her, the children sat huddled around Holly, their eyes glued to her tablet. Sophie wondered if they had any idea what was happening. Their small bags, like suitcases, each labeled NTC, surrounded them. An overwhelming sense of empathy grabbed hold of her. It was heartbreaking. The apocalypse hadn't just turned the kids into orphans. It had stripped away their innocence, turning Jeff and David into soldiers. The distant but familiar thrum of helicopter blades sent a chill down Sophie's body. She quickly turned back to the tarmac, raising a hand above her eyes to shield them from the intense sun. She saw the NTC gunship as it swooped into the valley, trailing a stream of dense smoke. "Looks like something's happened," Bauma whispered. "Keel, get your ass up here." He looked back and searched the shadows. "Emmanuel, you too." Sophie took a step back, making way for the Marines. They fanned out onto the tarmac, their pulse rifles angled at the skyline. Emmanuel followed close behind, the RVAMP attached to his back like a turtle shell. Keel limped into position behind the rusted hull of the minivan they'd commandeered in Colorado Springs a few weeks before, while Bauma crouched in the center of the landing strip. Emmanuel stopped at the northern edge of the tarmac. Their weapons skimmed the sky beyond the gunship. But Sophie saw no signs of aliens. No blue drones or black ships. Just the death they had left in their wake. Sophie flinched at the sound of a voice behind her. "Are we leaving now?" She turned to see Jeff standing in the shadows. He looked past her, his hand gripping his rifle. "Yes. Gather the others and meet us outside in 5 minutes, she replied. The boy nodded and moved back inside. The thump of the sea serpent's blades drowned out his footsteps as it descended over the tarmac. It lingered there for a few moments, kicking up a halo of dust around Bauma before finally setting down. The Marine approached the chopper with an arm shielding his face from the wind. When the hydraulic lift gate hit the concrete, Sophie turned to the children. Holly and Jeff had corralled them around the blast doors. "Are you guys ready to take a ride?" Sophie asked. Owen gripped his blanket in one hand and Jamie's hand in the other. "Is that what's going to take us home?" he asked, pointing. Anxious to get in the air, she simply nodded and grabbed Jamie's hand. "Let's move!" someone yelled. Sophie ushered the children forward, leading them toward the chopper. When they got to the lift gate, a pair of NTC soldiers guided the kids into the cargo bay, where a dozen armored men waited. The two men buckled the kids in and then returned to Sophie. "Welcome aboard," one of them said. She looked up to see Captain Noble extending a hand. "Thank you," she said, taking his grip. He helped her up the ramp and led her to a seat next to Jeff. "You're safe now," he said to the kids. His voice was calm and confident. As soon as everyone had filed in, the NTC crew chief manning the doors pushed a red button that activated the lift gate. The hiss of the hydraulics echoed through the compartment and the ramp angled shut. They were in the air before it closed. Sophie watched the glass doors of the biosphere shrink below them. Sophie said. "What the fuck is left to save?" someone shouted from the back. The voice hadn't come over the comm channel, which meant it was someone on Dr. Winston's team. Noble searched the compartment for whoever had been stupid enough to ask that question. "Everything down there is dead," Keel said. "The cities are all ruined." "What did you expect?" Corporal Balma asked him. Keel shrugged. "I guess." He shook his head and strapped himself in. "I thought there would be something left to save." His voice was obnoxious, and Noble wished the man would shut up. But the farther they flew, the more Noble began to question how anyone could have survived for this long. He reminded himself that it didn't really matter. Their mission was no longer to monitor the biospheres or to find survivors. It was to destroy the aliens. After that, he would find his crew a new home. He continued to stare out the window. There was a hunger growing inside him. It coursed through his entire body. At first he wasn't sure what it was, but with every passing second the feeling intensified. He couldn't shake the Marine's words. Noble snapped his fingers in Keel's direction. "You're wrong." Keel cracked his knuckles. "Yeah? How do you figure?" "When those poles come crashing down, and the organics around the world are flopping on the dirt like fish out of water." Noble paused to make sure the man was looking at him. "Humans will emerge from their holes. There will be survivors. We will find a way to persevere. We always find a way." Jeff tried not to focus on his arm. The pain had returned after he'd forgotten to take one of the pills before the flight. Wincing, he leaned over to David. His brother cracked an eyelid. "Are we there yet?" Jeff managed a short laugh. "Another hour or so, I think." David suddenly looked very serious. "Where are we going?" Jeff hesitated. He wasn't exactly sure how to answer the question. Sure, he knew their destination was Omaha, Nebraska, and from there they were going to board a spaceship that Sophie had called the Sunspot. But were they really leaving Earth? Were they really going to Mars? "You're going to a safe place," came a voice. Jeff searched the seats to their left. A helmet with the name Diego on the top stuck out from the rest. "Safe?" David asked. The soldier nodded. "Do we get to kill some aliens first?" David added. Diego laughed. "Maybe, kid. Maybe." A jolt of pain raced up Jeff's arm, but he ignored it. Soon he would face the monsters again. Emmanuel fidgeted in his seat, wondering exactly what they would find at Offutt. But that wasn't the only thing on his mind, or on the minds of those around him, he imagined. No, everyone had a reason for being on this flight. They'd all suffered loss. They'd all been through the unimaginable, and somehow they'd survived. "Offutt Air Force Base, ETA 15 minutes, the pilot's voice said over the PA system. The words confirmed that this wasn't a dream. After almost 3 months of being cooped up in the biosphere with little hope of ever making it out, they were now close to salvation. It was hard to believe. Reaching over, Emmanuel grabbed Sophie's hand and massaged her palm with his thumb. She glanced over and smiled. "How are you feeling?" "So far, so good," she replied. "The headaches are manageable now." She pulled free from his grasp and itched her scalp. Pulling a strand of hair from her head, she held it in front of him. "Not sure I like this, though," she said with a scowl.
The R-vamp blast may have saved your life, but those side effects will probably last a while. Hopefully the Sunspot has a better medical facility than the one we had at Cheyenne Mountain." She turned to face the window. They were passing over what had once been the Farm Belt, an area of fertile fields that had fed much of the world. Millions of acres were now the same bleak deserts that had marked the rest of their journey. Seeing the destruction firsthand was very different from looking at the satellite imagery Lolo had provided. Being a native of the Midwest, the sight was particularly chilling for Emmanuel. He had grown up in Chicago, but his grandparents had owned a farm outside the city. He was there every weekend, riding on the lawnmower with his grandfather and playing hide-and-seek with his cousins. And now it was all gone, reduced to dust. Disgusted, Emmanuel forced himself to look away. Sophie reached for his hand. With their fingers intertwined, they sat in silence, hoping that Offutt wasn't going to be another White Sands, and that, unlike Secundo Casu, the Sunspot was waiting for them. The Sea Serpent hovered over a graveyard of X-90s. Captain Noble wasn't fazed. The rover they'd deployed a week before hadn't just discovered the Sunspot. They'd also discovered a separate hangar full of jets and drones, more than enough to launch his strike. Noble sucked in a short breath and opened the door to the cockpit. Standing over the pilot's shoulder, he scanned the ground for the building. Through the dirt-streaked windshield, Offutt no longer looked like a military base. It looked like a war zone. The dust storms had eaten the formidable symbol of American military might inch by inch, leaving behind a trail of collapsed buildings and the twisted wrecks of aircraft. One stronghold remained, a group of buildings at the center of the base that had been protected by the outer buildings. "Put us down," Noble said. "Over there." He pointed to the largest dome-shaped building, hardly recognizable in the sea of dust. "Aye, aye, sir." The pilot twisted the cyclic to the right and guided the gunship toward the cluster of thumb-sized hangars. Noble gripped the back of the man's seat, bracing himself as they descended over the tarmac. "Prepare for landing," the pilot said over the PA system. A corona of dust swirled outside the cockpit. The chirp from a warning sensor followed seconds later, prompting Noble to take a seat and buckle in. "Good idea, sir," the pilot said. He moved his hand across the dashboard and activated the center console. The landing zone, marked by a series of red lines, flickered across the display. Noble concentrated on the radar screen. "Any sign of dust storms?" The pilot looked away from the center console to check. "Looks clear," he said, "but I wouldn't trust that piece of hardware." Noble locked eyes with the man. There was no hiding the apprehension in the pilot's gaze. "Can't predict Mother Nature, not anymore," he said. He shifted back to the main console. "The rules have changed, sir. I just hope a storm like those that ruined this base doesn't show up while we're here." "How much notice would we have?" The pilot shook his head. "Minutes, maybe a bit more." The chopper landed with a thump. Noble unfastened his belt and patted the pilot on the back. "Keep an eye on things. I want the Sea Serpent ready to go at a moment's notice." "Aye, aye, sir." Taking one last glance out the windshield, Noble headed back to the cargo bay. He was greeted by a dozen helmets and the biosphere team staring anxiously in his direction. It was odd seeing the children sitting there with their NTC suitcases, as though they were about to board some cruise liner. "All right, people, we're moving out in 5 minutes." He stood in the center of the cabin and activated the mini-map on the main display. "Location A will be our forward operating base. Location B is the hangar housing the NTC Sunspot. As you can see, they are about a mile apart. If one team runs into trouble, it will be difficult for the other team to provide support, so stay sharp." Noble searched the group for Sophie. "Dr. Winston, Lieutenant Diego will escort your team. Everyone else, you're with me." "You heard the man?" Diego shouted. "Let's move out!" The soldiers made final preparations, checking helmets, loading magazines, and stretching. Noble followed the soldiers out onto the tarmac, the excitement building inside him with every step. They fanned out and set up a perimeter around the Sea Serpent. Their movements were precise, calculated. They'd done this 100 times before. Above them, the sky had turned an off-gray, taking on the color of the landscape below. A single crimson smear streaked across the horizon like a bloodstain. Noble couldn't help but wonder if it foreshadowed what was to come.
He paused outside the lift gate and said, "Hold position." He winced as he flung the strap of his rifle over his injured shoulder. The pain was still present, but it reminded him he was alive, and if he was alive, he could still fight. Sophie and her team stood at the edge of the ramp. "Captain," Sophie said from the ramp. She ran a sleeve across her forehead. "I wanted to thank you. You risked everything to evacuate us."
Any soldier would have done the same.
Sophie shook her head. "Not any soldier, Captain."
"It was the least we could do after all the intel you've given us,"
Noble replied. She raised a hand to shield her eyes and looked over his shoulder. Then, gesturing with her chin, she said, "You know, it's not too late to change your mind. You could all come with us to Mars." The comment took the captain by surprise. He hadn't considered leaving the planet. This was his home. And if he defeated the organics, he would return to the GOA and help humanity start over.
"Can't do that," he said. "My duty is here. I have to do what I can to take back the planet."
She nodded. "I know. We need to move," Diego said, his voice low and anxious. Noble nodded. "Good luck, Doctor," he said, reaching out to shake her hand, and then turning to the rest of her team. "Good luck to all of you. When you find Dr. Hoffman, tell him—" Noble hesitated. The words clung to the tip of his tongue. "Tell him he was wrong about defeating the organics." "What do you mean?" Sophie asked. Noble didn't answer. He was already moving with his men. Hoffman would understand the cryptic comment when she found him, if she ever found the doctor, he reminded himself. "Let's move!" Noble shouted. He flashed a series of hand signals in the direction of the buildings in the distance. As he moved toward the domed structures, he recalled Keel's words. "What's left to save?" the man had asked. The question echoed in Noble's mind, and the closer he got to the hangar, the more he wondered the same thing. Were there still humans hidden in bunkers and strongholds that he didn't know about? There have to be, he thought. There are always survivors. Chapter 23. Sophie felt one of the children tug on her sleeve. "It's so hot out here," Owen said, looking up at her. Damp hair stuck to his forehead. She offered him a reassuring smile and wiped a strand from his eyes. "Don't worry, we're almost there," she said. Ahead of them, Lieutenant Diego guided the group across the sea of sand. Wind peppered the unprotected team with rocks that stung Sophie's bare skin. For her, the pain was nothing more than an annoyance, a reminder of the changed world, a world she was ready to leave. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see the faint outlines of Noble's men. They were just specks on the horizon now, blurred by the swirling clouds of dust and dirt. She hadn't thought much more about the strike on the poles, and while she wished Noble the best, she wasn't concerned much with the outcome. The Earth was already dead to her. The future was, and always had been, on Mars. "Almost there! Stay close!" Diego shouted over the growing wind. Another gust hammered Sophie. She winced but steadied herself with Emmanuel's help. He'd shadowed her every step since they left the Sea Serpent. "Thanks," she said, "but really, I'm fine." Emmanuel shot her a pained look. "Really? Because I'm dying over here." Sophie chuckled for the first time in days. Being so close to the sunspot had brightened her mood. "Don't worry. We're almost there." Owen tugged on her sleeve again. "Sorry," she said, taking his hand and leading him into the wind. The entire team pushed forward. A few feet ahead, Jeff pulled David along with his good arm. To the boy's right, Balma carried Jamie on his back, and out in front, Holly helped Keel. For a moment, Sophie felt as though they were missing someone. They had lost Overton, Timothy, and Safi. They were all still painful memories, but there was someone else. "Alexia," she thought. Sophie suddenly felt vulnerable, more so than ever before. Without the AI, she had only humans to rely on. It was an odd revelation, but there was no turning back now. Alexia was gone. She'd made her decision, one that Sophie respected. "Careful!" Diego shouted. "Watch your step!" They'd come up on a section of the landing strip that looked like a junkyard. Partially buried under the dirt were the blackened hulls of X-90s, wings angled toward the sky like fins. She sidestepped one of them, pulling Owen with her. When they finally reached the hangar, the storm was already near. Diego waited for them at the cracked door. "Get inside," he said, gesturing with an armored hand into the darkness. Sophie held her breath and slipped into the safety of the building. As her eyes adjusted to the dim lighting, she gasped. Towering above them was the Sunspot, the ship that would take them to Mars. Noble ran as fast as his legs would allow. While the armored suit was nimble, the months spent cramped inside the GOA had left him out of shape and, frankly, not physically prepared for the mission. Ahead, he could see their salvation. The two-story hangar housing his arsenal of X-90s and drones jutted out of the swirling dust. A set of large access doors marked the main entrance. He remembered the maintenance access from the rover mission and flashed a hand signal to two dust-covered soldiers with their backs to the building. They nodded and disappeared around the right corner. Chinning his comm, Noble said, "Form a perimeter around these doors." Battling another wind gust, the team fanned out around the building, their weapons aimed at the failing structure. Above them, a loose power line whipped against the metal side of the building, whining in the storm. The hangar was just as he remembered it from the images. The green paint was cracked and sandblasted off the metal siding. Shards of glass lined the windows. It was remarkable what the storms had done to civilization in such a short time. Hugging the side of the building, Noble rounded the corner and caught a glimpse of the two soldiers waiting at the maintenance door. Like a pair of gargoyles, they stood guard next to the fallen door. Its metal was covered with a thick layer of dust. "Any contacts?" Noble asked. Both men shook their heads. "No, sir." The smaller man wiped his visor free of grime. The machine gunner, Ramirez, stared back at him. "Good, let's move," Noble replied. Without hesitating, he stepped onto the door. The metal moaned under the weight of his boot. He shouldered his rifle and paused in the side entrance. The beam from his helmet lamp cut the darkness in two. Moving his rifle barrel in conjunction with the light, he scanned the room quickly, stopping on the sleek black outlines of three X-90s. "Jackpot," he said. He continued through the room with the men on his heels. They quickly cleared the space and then stopped to admire the jets. Ramirez reached out and ran his hand over the wing. "Beautiful piece of machinery," Noble said. "I just hope they work." He pointed to the hangar doors at the other end of the room. "Let the others in." Ramirez flung his rifle strap over his shoulder and jogged over to the set of double doors. Seconds later, the screech of metal grinding against metal filled the hangar. A powerful gust of wind exploded through the opening, showering the men with shrapnel. "Get inside! Move! Move!" Noble yelled. One by one, the filthy NTC soldiers emerged. Brushing off their armor, they formed a circle around him. He considered saying something heroic, something that would inspire them. But behind every visor he saw men who were ready, prepared to fight to the end. Noble focused on the tallest of the group. "Ort." The man stepped forward with a duffel bag in each hand. "Yes, sir." A sudden vibration rocked the building, sending a tremor through the metal siding. The roof groaned in response. Flakes of dust rained down as another quake shook the ceiling. "Not sure how much life this girl has left in her," Ort said. Noble snorted. "I was thinking the same thing. All the more reason to hurry up." Gesturing to the X-90s, he said, "Someone help Ort get set up." Ramirez followed the engineer to the first jet, where he dropped one of the duffel bags and then hurried to the second and third. "All right, Andy, Howard, and Reardon," Noble said. "Check your flight systems. Get those beauties up and running." "Yes, sir," they replied simultaneously. Kurt stepped up. "Where are my drones?" Noble pointed to another set of wide doors at the end of the warehouse. "Through those doors." Noble faced the other soldiers. "The rest of you take up locations at every access point in this building. Got it?" The 5 remaining men nodded and spread out in different directions. Sucking in a deep breath, Noble moved to the next phase of his plan. "Follow me, Kurt," he said. They hurried across the room. The large double doors were already open when they got there. Noble raised his pulse rifle. Blinking on his HUD, he scanned the dark room for any sign of contacts. The scan picked up 0 traces of heat signatures. Another blink on the display faded. He reached for his helmet lamp and activated it with a click. The building shook again. "Stay behind me," he whispered. Kurt's anxious breathing followed him into the darkness. Their thin beams danced in front of them. The room served as more of a maintenance facility than a warehouse. In the right corner sat the idle rover he'd deployed 5 days earlier, its camera still angled at a row of black drones all draped with dusty sheets. He counted 9 total. Satisfied, he swept his light across the room and found a cluster of monitors. The command center, he thought. He rubbed his hands together. "We're in business," Noble said. "See if you can get this thing up and running." "On it," Kurt replied. Footsteps drew Noble's attention back to the doorway. In the shadow stood Ramirez. Clearing his throat, he said, "Sir, we have a problem." Noble cringed. "What is it?" "One of the X-90s is dead." "What do you mean, dead?" Kurt asked. Noble cursed under his breath. He knew exactly what the soldier meant. The jets were built to withstand the blasts from modern EMPs, and he'd gambled that the magnetic disturbance hadn't penetrated their hardened casing. Apparently he'd lost that bet. "The other 2 are online?" Noble asked. "Yes, sir," Ramirez said. In a voice that conveyed confidence, Noble said, "We're still in the game. I can work with 2. He turned to Kurt. "Who are my best 2 pilots?" The man paused to think. "I'd say Reardon and Howard." "Ramirez, tell Andy to get his ass back here. He can help with the drones," he said. Turning to Kurt, he added, "I don't want you flying all of them on your own anyway." The pilot exhaled as if a huge burden had been lifted off him. The 2 men moved to the command center. A pile of papers remained on the main desk, left untouched where their previous owner had abandoned them nearly 3 months ago. Moving to the other side of the station, Noble looked for the power source. A cable snaked beneath the desk, covered by a thin layer of dust. Dropping to one knee, he grabbed the cord, hoping desperately that it still worked, then pulled the end toward him and plugged it in. "Got it," Kurt said. Noble glanced up at the pilot. He sat comfortably in one of the chairs. Through his visor, Noble could see the younger man grinning. Reaching out slowly with his right index finger, Kurt swiped the screen. It flickered to life, spreading a cool green glow over the room. "I can't believe it still works," Kurt laughed. Wincing, Noble stood and walked over behind him. "All systems go." "We're about to find out," Kurt said. He punched a series of commands into the system. Leaning closer, he squinted. "Looks like—" The man suddenly clapped. A lump formed in Noble's throat. He wasn't sure if the man's reaction was one of joy or frustration. Another line of data rolled across the screen and Kurt stiffened. He typed another few keystrokes. "Well?" Noble finally asked. Kurt tapped his armored index finger on the desk nervously. "Waiting." Noble focused on the display. "Yes, I'm in!" Kurt blurted. This time the captain clapped. After months of hiding, he was finally in a position to stop the organics. Sophie pulled her flashlight from her belt and pointed it at the sunspot. As the beam moved down the length of the ship, it grew smaller and smaller until it was only a white dot. "My God," she thought. It had to be the size of a football field, with the wings stretching half that distance. Moving the light back to the nose, she stopped on the only visible marking, sunspot. She stared at the spaceship with fascination. There was a part of her that hadn't believed it was real, hadn't believed it was possible, but here it was, looming above them, waiting to travel to the stars and beyond. She shot an excited glance behind her. Standing quietly at the door were the others. They stared above her, at the ship that dwarfed them. Owen pulled on Holly's and Balma's hands and jumped into the air. Letting out a loud screech, he said, "We get to ride on that!" Balma chuckled. "Sure do, buddy." The boy's lips formed a flabbergasted O, and then he said, "Wow!" Jamie, however, cowered behind Holly. "That thing looks scary," she whispered. Sophie did a half-turn, scanning the smooth surface of the spaceship. The girl was right. It was frightening. NTC engineers were never concerned with aesthetics. They only cared about what worked. She hoped that the engineers had finished the ship. Like the Secundo Kasu, the sunspot was a prototype, never tested outside the Earth's atmosphere. "How do we get in this thing?" Emmanuel asked. "I was hoping you knew," she replied. Diego unfolded his arms and pulled a tablet from a pouch on his side. Crouching, he activated the small device and studied the surface. The blue glow illuminated his helmet, and Sophie saw his eyes for the first time. They were focused, determined. "Before you can board the ship, you must tap into the NTC system. Intel shows there's a command center underground," the man said, glancing up. He pointed toward a pair of maintenance doors halfway down the side of the building. "Those will lead you there." "And how do we get inside?" Keel interjected. "Don't worry," Diego said. "I have the codes." "Thank you," Sophie said, placing her hand on his shoulder. "Just doing my job, Doctor," he replied. Standing, he gestured toward the maintenance entry. "Better get moving. Once you guys are on board and prepped for flight, I'll be rejoining Captain Noble." Sophie acknowledged his statement with a nod. "Absolutely." She scanned the team, trying to decide how best to move forward. Even with the base seemingly clear, she didn't want to leave anyone behind without security. "Keel, you and Bauma stay here with the kids and Holly. Emmanuel, you're with us." They crossed the room, shadowing the side of the ship. Sophie kept her light pointed into the darkness, half expecting a spider to jump out at her. For some reason, she simply couldn't grasp the idea that the base was devoid of organics. It just didn't feel right. Still, she pushed on, scanning the shadows with a nervous eye. A full minute passed before they reached the double doors that led below. Sophie halted there, looking behind her. The rest of the team were camped out in a circle, their bags scattered loosely around them. Bauma stood guard at the hangar door and flashed her a thumbs up. The twist and click of an unlocked door handle echoed through the room. "We're in," Diego said, his voice just shy of a whisper. Taking one last look at her team, she followed Diego and Emmanuel into the dark stairwell. She hesitated for a moment as a strange sensation washed over her. She'd felt it before, 2 days into the Biosphere mission when Alexia had said they'd lost contact with the outside world. That feeling was distinct, almost tangible. She could remember it vividly. And now she was having it again, like déjà vu. Diego stopped and shone his helmet light in her face. "You okay, Doctor?" Shielding her eyes from the brightness, she nodded. "You sure?" Emmanuel asked. "Are the headaches back? Do you need to stop?" "No, let's keep moving," she said, forcing her right foot onto the next step. Licking her cracked lips, she continued. But with every step down the dry, humid stairway, the feeling that she was never going to see her team again grew stronger. Chapter 24. The storm rattled the building with a growing ferocity. Noble looked up from his monitor and eyed the roof with a cocked brow, expecting the metal sheet to peel off and sail into the wind. He could picture an angry red twister swooping in and sucking his men into the sky, tearing them limb from limb. He pushed the thought aside. He needed to focus on the mission and not get sidetracked by pointless fear. "How are we doing, Kurt?" Noble spun his chair to face the pilot. The man typed a series of commands into the interface and then strode over to one of the drones. "Working, sir. I hope to have these all online within the hour," he said, extending his right arm in an outward motion as if he was showcasing the row of drones to a potential buyer. Noble glanced at the mission clock in the upper right edge of his HUD. They were already behind schedule. Ort had run into a problem installing the RVAMP monitors in the X-90 cockpits. Without them, the pilots would have no way of knowing what distance to keep from the drones. "I need those jets," Noble thought, clenching his jaw. He stood and jogged across the room to the wide doors that opened into the first hangar. The whine of portable power tools echoed inside his helmet. A pair of legs protruded out from under the wing of the closest jet. Noble bent down. Ort drilled a final bolt to secure one of the RVMs. He slid out from under the jet and pushed himself to his feet. "Almost done, but I had a hell of a time with those monitors." He sucked in a breath.
Man, I'm freaking burning up in here. I think the AC unit in my suit is toast. Reaching up, he unfastened his helmet and pulled it off. He placed it gently onto the floor and then took a long swig from his water bottle. Dragging his sleeve over his mouth, he said, I should be able to get the RVamps installed in an hour. You have 30 minutes, Noble replied. He glanced up at the ceiling again. If that. Roger, sir, I'm on it. Ort grabbed his helmet with one hand and the remaining duffel bag with his other. The two working X-90s were facing the entrance, their beak-shaped noses pointed toward the metal doors. Noble clasped his hands together behind his back. The sight gave him great satisfaction. They were one step closer. Ramirez joined the captain behind the jets. Any word from Diego? Not yet, Noble replied without taking his focus off the X-90s. Another gust of wind struck the building's side. The walls shuddered, the ringing echoing through the room. Several of the other men glanced nervously at the ceiling. Noble brought his chin down hard on the comm. Everyone listen up. We're about 30 minutes from go time. Keep sharp. Sophie opened the door and saw the rodent before she heard its feet skittering across the floor. The rat took off down the hallway where the stairwell ended. Without a night vision-capable NTC suit, Sophie was forced to use her flashlight. She aimed it at the filthy creature, catching a red set of eyes and a frail body cowering in the darkness. It was odd, seeing a living animal all the way down here, and she found herself thinking again of the emaciated cat they discovered back in Colorado Springs. Noble's words aboard the Sea Serpent replayed in her mind. There will be survivors. Humans will emerge from their holes. She knew the odds, as Alexia had. The statistics didn't lie, nor did the scenery. Humans had lost the planet, and the resource that had sustained life for billions of years. Sure, a few survivors might be lurking out there just like the rat, but without water, they too would die. Beside her, Diego studied his tablet. He glanced up. Pointing at the surface of the device, he said, Take a look. They crowded around the tablet, and Sophie saw the red lines representing the tunnels. Looks like they snake for miles beneath the base. The command center, where we can activate the sunspot, is only about a quarter mile from here. We have a good little hike, Emmanuel replied. Better get moving, Sophie added. Diego nodded and returned his tablet to his side pouch. Then he tucked his fingers inside his pulse rifle strap and detached the weapon. With the barrel pointing forward, they pushed on. Sophie wasted no time following suit. The three moved quickly through the darkness. Their lights flickered across the concrete, illuminating the hallway several hundred feet ahead. She forced a swallow as the headache she thought had passed reared up inside her skull. The pain grew with every step. I need to stop, she said, panting. I'm sorry. She reached out and braced herself against the wall. Emmanuel approached her from behind, placing a sweaty palm on her forearm. Then he reached back and removed a water bottle from his belt. Almost there, he said with a reassuring squeeze. Twisting the cap off, she brought the bottle to her lips. The water, now warm, slid down her dry throat. Careful not to waste a single drop, she cupped one hand under her chin. A few stragglers fell into her palm, and she lapped them up. Handing the bottle back to Emmanuel, she said, Finish it off. The sunspot will have an endless supply. Almost as soon as she said it, she realized there was a possibility she was wrong. Emmanuel must have had the same epiphany. How do we even know the water biome will be intact? Shit! He shook his head and adjusted the straps of the dual RVM-RVamp machine on his back. I didn't even think about that, but what if? Sophie stopped him by waving a finger. Too late now. We have to hope the ship made it this far without being touched. She swept her light over the floor and then into the distance. I see no signs of the aliens. Doesn't mean they weren't here before, Diego said. Either way, let's keep moving. We're almost there. Sophie massaged her temples and sucked in a lungful of scorching air. The breath burned her throat where just seconds ago the water had cooled it. She waited for Emmanuel to follow Diego, and then fell in behind them. The same déjà vu she'd felt earlier reemerged. This time it was even more intense, prompting a wave of goosebumps.
Something was wrong. Things just didn't make sense. It was too quiet. Questions she knew she should have asked earlier came to mind. Why had the sunspot been left behind at Offit? And why was the base clear of the organics? Even if they had migrated, we use the RVAP. They can still be saved. Emmanuel looked at her in disbelief. I will kill you, Sophie. You can't survive a blast at this range. She grabbed his wrist and squeezed it. I don't care. I won't let them die. No, Emmanuel said, shaking his head. I won't do it. The spiders shrieked at the sound of Emmanuel's voice. Diego took a step back, shouldering his rifle. We have to move, guys. Pronto! Emmanuel could see him saying something into his mini-mic, but couldn't make out the words. Command isn't responding, Diego replied. Get down! He yelled, raising his rifle and firing. Sophie held Emmanuel's gaze as Diego emptied his magazine into the mass of aliens. The pulse rounds infuriated the hungry group. Scratch, scrape, scratch, scrape. Emmanuel pulled his wrist free from her grasp and reached for the strap securing the RVAP to his back. With trepidation, he unfastened the device and laid it in front of them. Sophie, please don't do this, he said. Tears flowed freely down his face. They're coming! Diego shouted between shots. If you're gonna do something, you better do it fast! She managed to smile. I love you, Emmanuel. Then she dropped the .45 onto the ground and pulled. and heard his screams as darkness over their fingers down on the green button together. An invisible button. Sophie. Please don't do this, he said. Tears flowed freely down his face. They're coming! Diego shouted between shots. If you're gonna do something, you better do it fast! She managed to smile. I love you, Emmanuel. Then she dropped the .45 onto the ground and pulled the RVAP between them. His fingers intertwined with hers. She forced their fingers down on the green button together. An invisible blast of electromagnetic energy exploded from the device. Pain raced through her system, lighting her nerves on fire. She twisted, jerked, and twitched uncontrollably. And then it was over. She felt her body slump into Emmanuel's arms and heard his screams as darkness overtook her. The sun glimmered high in the afternoon sky. On the horizon, dark clouds of dust moved away from the base. The carcasses of several armored vehicles rested in the storm's wake, their fading paint reflecting the abuse inflicted on them over the past few months. Flanked by Kurt and Ort, the captain stood with his arms crossed, staring out over the tarmac. He watched Howard and Reardon climb into the cockpits of the X-90s. His team had maneuvered the jets and the drones around the wreckage and cleared a path for their takeoff. Both pilots gave a thumbs up as soon as the glass windshields locked into place above them. Then, with a ground-shaking roar, they flared up the engines. Flames burst from their cylinder exhaust tubes. Noble smiled and, in sync with Ort and Kurt, saluted the two pilots. They returned the gesture. The concrete rumbled a second later as the jets lurched forward. The captain shielded his face from the heat and a powerful wind gust, watching through a fort of fingers as the jets raced down the tarmac and lifted into the air. With the planes clear, Andy launched the drones, controlling them manually from the command center. Within a minute, the sky was filled with the most beautiful sight Noble had seen in months. Human air power. The X-90s screamed across the skyline, streaking northwest, 3 drones following in their exhaust trails, and then they were just black specks. The other 6 drones peeled off in different directions. Noble nodded, watching the final blip disappear on the horizon. With a deep breath, he turned back to the hangar. Their first target, Mount McKinley, was a little over 2,600 miles away. With jets capable of speeds up to 2,200 miles per hour, the pilots would make it there in a little over an hour. That would give them at least 30 minutes to take down the pole before the surge reconnected. Now all he had to do was wait. Operation Redemption was officially underway. When the rumble from the jets had completely vanished, Noble heard a distant voice. He spun to see a soldier running across the tarmac. It was Diego, and he was screaming. Chapter 26. The ceiling had stopped rattling a few minutes before. The rumble from the X-90s and drones had waned away. Noble's men had successfully launched, just narrowly avoiding the blast from the R-van. But Emmanuel didn't care. He held Sophie's limp body in his arms, sobbing as he watched her life force drain away. He shook her softly, mumbling her name over and over. She twitched, her chest heaving and torso jerking, just involuntary muscle spasms. Her frozen pupils stared in different directions, a result of the electrical current the nanobots had released when they were destroyed. In the end, it was the device he had made that killed her. He would live with that guilt for the rest of his life. He glanced up, tears cascading off his face and flopping onto the concrete. They were surrounded by a blue field of alien bodies, twisted and mangled from the R-van's blast. Beyond their corpses, the 4 floating orbs had crashed to the ground, their translucent skin melting around the child imprisoned inside. Setting Sophie softly on the ground, Emmanuel stood and raced over to them. As he approached, he heard several stifled whimpers, but the sound wasn't coming from the children. He stepped over the spiders and found Holly and Balma lying in the shadows of the hangar doors. They had been so close to escaping, the Marine's hands just feet away. "Help the kids," Holly choked. Emmanuel quickly scanned her body. A large gash decorated her upper arm, but she would live. Balma, on the other hand, was a wreck. He was unconscious, and when Emmanuel saw his injuries, he could see why. The spiders had pierced his right thigh and upper left chest. His uniform was soaked in scarlet. Holly dragged herself across the floor and applied pressure to Balma's leg. She glanced up at Emmanuel, a curtain of bloody blonde hair hanging from her face. "Go, Emmanuel." He nodded and ran to the children. Jeff and David lay just feet away from each other, their eyes closed. Emmanuel crouched down and felt David's neck for a pulse. He found one. Weak, but he was alive. Then he moved to Jamie and Owen. Their small bodies were covered in blue goo. He pulled Jamie from the fluid first, removing the gunk from her mouth and face. Then he put her softly on the concrete and worked on Owen. They were both breathing, but their heartbeats felt weak. He couldn't wrap his mind around what had happened. Adrenaline kept him moving. Save the living, he thought. You can't do anything for Sophie now. His eyes welled up again as he cleaned the children of alien slime. It was hard to imagine that he and Holly were the only original members of the Biosphere team left. What had started out as a mission to save the world had turned into World War III, and he was the only one left unscathed. Grinding metal rang out at the other end of the chamber, startling Emmanuel. He glanced over his shoulder as Diego waved a squad of NTC soldiers into the room. They spread out under the sunspot, their sleek black armor glimmering in the withering blue light. "We need medical attention!" Emmanuel shouted. He looked up at the ship looming above them, his eyes focusing on the open door. And then suddenly he remembered. Why hadn't he thought of it before? The ship had a full medical facility, just like the biosphere at Cheyenne Mountain, and inside there were a dozen or more cryo chambers, all designed for extended space travel. If he could get the children into them, he could basically freeze them until they reached Mars. Surely Dr. Hoffman and his team could save them. Maybe they could even save... He looked back at Sophie's limp body. A soldier leaned over her, his headlamp illuminating her pale face. Emmanuel knew it was a long shot, but maybe she could be brought back. Shocked into motion, Emmanuel stood and snapped his fingers. "Diego!" he shouted. "I need your men to get these kids and Sophie into the cryo chambers inside the ship!" "On it," the soldier said. "We need a medic too!" Holly yelled. She pumped Bauma's chest frantically. "He's not breathing!" One of the soldiers sprinted over to them and, dropping to a knee, opened a small black medical kit. He shooed Holly aside and began working on the Marine. Above them, the bank of red lights surrounding the door to the sunspot blinked. The NTC soldiers rushed back and forth. Emmanuel's vision blurred. He could hear someone yelling his name, but the words were indecipherable. They were so fucking close. So close to leaving that damned planet and all the death behind. And now Sophie, his beloved Sophie. He couldn't bear to watch the NTC soldier carry her body up the ramp into the sunspot. His only hope rested with the cryo chambers. Moving aside, Emmanuel watched the other men scoop up Jamie and Owen. Their arms hung loosely over armored shoulders, their eyes detached, staring at nothing. Sucking in a long, measured breath, he closed his eyes, and then followed the group into the belly of the spaceship. The mission clock on Captain Noble's HUD read 17:05. Almost there, he thought. He paced nervously behind Kurt's monitor, his gaze shifting from the display to the hangar doors every few seconds. He still hadn't heard back from Diego. The man had come tearing across the tarmac, screaming about spiders that had attacked the biosphere team. He'd deployed all but 3 of his men to help. The wait for their return was eating him alive. He turned back to the monitors, anticipation building in his gut as he watched Howard's and Reardon's jets inch across the display, marked red 9 and green 6. The 2 X-90s were now a finger's length away from their target. Thanks to Lolo, they had secured an encrypted feed with both pilots. The video streaming from the cockpits fed straight to Noble's command center at Offutt. He saw what they saw. It was like being behind the wheel without having to drive. A coward's game, he thought, wishing again he could be there himself. Crackling white noise filled his earpiece. He flinched, waiting for the transmission. He hoped desperately for good news, but a long wave of static washed over the channel. He didn't have time for this. He reached up and tapped his helmet with an armored finger, as if it would help the weak comm feed. "Captain, this is Diego. Do you copy?" Diego repeated the message, his voice shaky and unsure. "Yes. Yes. I'm here," Noble replied. "Give me a full report." "Sir, there have been casualties. Dr. Sophie Winston appears to be..." He paused. "She appears to be dead, sir. The children are all severely injured. Dr. Rodriguez thinks they might be able to save them if we put them in the cryo chambers to preserve their bodies until they can find proper medical care." "My God," Noble said, choking on his words. "It's bad, sir. And that's not all. Dr. Brown and Corporal Bauma were injured. They should both live, but the other Marine Keel was killed inside the sunspot. They woke up a fucking nest of aliens. Noble hammered his fist down, stopping just short of the table. He should have used the rover to scan the sunspot, but after discovering the drones, he'd simply left to plan the rest of the mission. Once again, he'd failed, and lives, precious lives, had been lost due to his negligence. "Sure they're almost to Mount McKinley," Kurt said. Noble shook his thoughts away. He needed to focus. He couldn't lose it now, not when Howard and Reardon were so close to their target. "Diego, do what you can for the team. Have your men help them prepare the ship for launch and then get back here." "Roger." Noble filled his lungs with a deep breath, relieving some of the built-up anxiety. A bead of sweat trickled down his nose and landed on the stubble growing where his mustache had filled his face weeks earlier. He wanted desperately to run his finger across his face. It had always calmed him. Instead, he moved to the seat next to Kurt. Crossing his arms, Noble said, "Get me the feed inside Red 9. Kurt reached to his left and swiped the screen. The monitor flickered and the view from Howard's cockpit emerged. Clocking 2,200 miles per hour, the jet screamed through the air. The skyline was a blur of orange light. A black speck glimmered on the horizon. "That's Reardon," Kurt said, pointing at the dot. Noble nodded. "How are our drones doing?" He turned to Andy, who sat a few feet away, his eyes plastered to a set of dual monitors. "They're flying on autopilot for now," Andy replied. "Once they reach their targets, we'll switch them back to manual. That's where I come in," Kurt said. Data scrolling across the bottom of Howard's monitors showed the pilot's X-90 was at terminal velocity. "Be advised, target incoming," Reardon said. Kurt keyed a series of codes into the hollow interface and said, "Advise reducing speed in T-minus 30 seconds. The red and green dots on the radar screen blinked as Howard and Reardon acknowledged the request. In the bottom right corner of the display, Noble saw their speeds slowly reducing. As Howard's jet descended, the feed cleared. For the first time during the flight, Noble could see the landscape below. Closing his eyes, he pictured the great Alaskan frontier before the organics had invaded. Thousands of square miles of grass, crystal-clear streams snaking through the fields, herds of wildlife grazing freely, and snow-tipped mountain peaks. All reduced to ash. When his eyes snapped open, he saw the grave truth. The gray mountains were approaching fast, their jagged peaks devoid of snow, their ridgelines filled with petrified trees. A wildfire burned a section of forest for hundreds of square miles in the distance, filling the horizon with dark smoke. "Check your weapons systems. Prepare to attack," Noble said. "Roger that, Offutt. Preparing weapons systems," Reardon replied. Howard responded with an "Aye, aye," his red 9 dot blinking green. "Surge countdown is T-minus 43 minutes, Kurt said, looking up at Noble. "Howard, Reardon, you have 43 minutes to take this son of a bitch down," Noble said. He grunted when he saw the majestic peak of Mount McKinley rising out of the black smoke cloud. "They're going to have to fly through that." A short nod from Kurt confirmed the captain's fear. Static flickered over the comm. "Offutt, are you seeing this? Please advise. Over." "We're seeing it," Kurt replied. "Proceed through the smoke. Target is just on the other side. Over." Noble watched the dots streaking across the radar. Red 9 blinked first, but green 6 hesitated before acknowledging. He moved back to Howard's display. Flares of exhaust trailed Reardon's jet as it streaked toward the cloud, and then it was gone, swallowed by the smoke. The radio crackled a moment later. Reardon's voice sounded distressed. "Captain, we're picking up a strong magnetic disturbance. Please advise. Over." Kurt glanced up at Noble, his forehead lined with wrinkles. "Tell them to hold course for now," Noble replied. "Aye, aye," Kurt replied with a short hesitation. Noble checked the radar. Both dots looked like they were on top of Mount McKinley. That couldn't be right. Could it? Holding his breath, he counted down the seconds. Just as he reached 7, Howard's X-90 exploded out of the smoke. A chorus of warning sensors chirped over the channel. Emergency lights flickered across the dashboard. "Be advised, impact imminent," came an automated voice inside the cockpit. "Take immediate evasive measures." Before Noble had a chance to respond, he saw it. Mount McKinley towered above both jets. They were coming in too fast. 750 miles per hour too fast. He didn't need Kurt to tell him what had happened. The magnetic disturbance had disrupted their navigation equipment, and the smoke had rendered them blind. Screaming, Reardon yanked hard on the control stick. The jet pitched upward, and rays of sunlight washed over the cockpit. Intense light filled the display, forcing Noble to look away. He waited for an explosion as Reardon's and Howard's jets smashed into the gray mountain. But the sound never came. When he turned back to the monitor, he saw clear skies and the black dot of Reardon's X-90. Relief washed over Noble. "Circling," Howard said. His voice faded as an explosion rang out. "What the fuck was that?" the pilot said. He twisted in his seat, his camera showing two of the drones trailing him. The other had smashed into the side of Mount McKinley, flames licking the sky where the craft had blown to bits. "We lost drone 3, Kurt said, pointing to the radar. Noble grunted. "I can see that." He shifted his gaze from the radar to the feed from Howard's X-90. "My God!" the pilot suddenly said. Noble instantly saw why. The alien tower Lolo had discovered rose out of the south side of the mountain into the sky. The metallic sides pulsated, a blue light moving up and down the shaft in intermittent bursts. "That's it," Noble said, locking eyes with Kurt. "Take that fucking thing down." "Engaging," the pilot said. He swiped the screen, deactivating the autopilot on the two remaining drones. Andy sat up straighter and grabbed the joystick as his drone came online. "Reardon, Howard, protect the drones," Noble said. "No sign of contacts," Howard replied. A lump formed in the captain's throat. He'd expected resistance. Major resistance. But the skies appeared clear, the pole seemingly unprotected. He focused on the strange organic architecture. It throbbed with life. The pulsing of the alien light gave the impression of breathing. As Howard maneuvered around the tower, the light suddenly changed rhythm. The entire pole became solid blue. Seconds later it changed again. This time hundreds of miniature lights flickered, and one by one they pulled away from the construct. Countless cylinder-shaped objects peeled off the tower. Noble's stomach sank when he realized what they were. Shocked into motion, he stood and leaned over Kurt. "Hurry! Use the R-vamp while we still can!" Kurt navigated through the minefield of alien drones. The sky was filled with them like blue fireflies. They were everywhere. "There's too many!" Andy yelled. Noble saw the feed from his drone flicker and fade as it detonated into 1,000 pieces. "Fuck!" he said, cupping his head in his hands. Noble moved back to Kurt's monitor. The expert pilot zigzagged around the alien ships. With a quick jerk to the right, he pulled them away from the mountain. Then, with another swift movement, he changed course, this time straight up toward the sun. "Firing!" Howard said. The captain's eyes darted back to the X-90 feed as a volley of rockets launched at the sky that was now choking with tiny blue dots. Explosions burst across the display, several of the missiles sending the aliens into fiery poofs. But there were so many. "Bogies on my tail," Reardon said. Howard cried out over the channel. "They're everywhere!" "Keep them off Kurt's drone," Noble replied. "He has to get closer." Both of the pilots acknowledged, their dots blinking green on the radar. When Noble looked back at Howard's video, he saw impossible odds. The same odds humanity had faced all along. For a moment, Noble couldn't move. He couldn't even speak. He watched a wall of alien drones moving along a collision course with the X-90. They would do anything to stop the pilots from taking out their life source, even if it meant sacrificing themselves in the process. Howard screamed and jerked his plane to the right, but it was too late. Fire filled the display as the X-90 exploded in a cloud of debris. The monitor panned to Reardon's feed just as his jet exploded as well. Anger pulled Noble from his trance. "Use the fucking R-vamp, Kurt, now!" The pilot shot him a glance, his brown eyes pleading behind his visor. "But we aren't close enough." "You have to do it now while we still can!" Kurt nodded and tugged the control stick to the left, angling the drone back toward the mountain. The tower, now just a speck on the mountain, blinked as if it was tempting them. "Just a little closer," he muttered. Kurt's fingers hovered over the R-vamp button. Hovered too long. And in a fit of rage, the captain leaned forward and reached for it himself. He punched the button and waited for the invisible electromagnetic magic to work. Kurt, gasping in surprise, turned back to his interface and keyed in several commands. "The drone's gone, sir," the pilot choked. "Did it work?" Noble glanced down at him with bated breath. The pilot shoved the monitor away, sending the display crashing to the floor. Noble felt his heart sink. He knew, like Kurt, that Operation Redemption had failed. The planet lost. Chapter 27. Emmanuel removed his glasses and, using his shirt, cleaned the smears of blood off the lenses. When he put them back on, Sonia's hologram had emerged above the AI interface. The bridge, crowded with NTC soldiers, reminded him of a beehive. The armored men moved from station to station, activating the life support systems. Within minutes, the room flared to life, hollow displays spreading their warm light over the cold metal floor. Diego's team had already removed Keel's body and those of the ship's previous crew. What was left of them? The smell of rotting flesh, however, still lingered. "Dr. Rodriguez, all systems are now online," Sonia said. "How are the children?" he asked. "How is their vitals are all unchanged," Sonia replied. "Dr. Winston has entered a completely frozen state. Her body is technically alive, but her brain activity is minimal." The words hit Emmanuel like a belt to the face. He flinched and closed his eyes. Deep down, he knew before Sonia answered that Sophie was beyond saving, that she had died in his arms. But science and technology gave him hope, as it always did. He still held on to that hope. Without it, he had nothing. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Diego standing next to him. Emmanuel caught his gaze, finding strength there. "I'm sorry, Doctor. I really am." Emmanuel nodded. "Well, listen, I don't mean to detract from your loss, but there's something I think you should see." Taking a deep breath, Emmanuel attempted to pull himself together. "Follow me," Diego said. The soldier led him away from the bridge and through a passage that connected to Biome 1. At the end of the hall, two of his men held black garbage bags. "What's left of the crew?" Diego said, gesturing toward the gore-soaked walls. A partially raised metal blast door covered the glass entrance to Biome 1. Holding his nose, Emmanuel looked over at the lieutenant, not quite understanding why he'd brought him here. He ducked under the door. The chamber looked different from the one at Cheyenne Mountain. Instead of the curved ceiling that defined their old biome, this one was low. A bank of glowing lights extended from the panels illuminating the room. The dirt looked unscathed, the space completely undisturbed. It was then that he understood. Diego smiled when Emmanuel nodded. These brave men and women made their last stand in this hallway to prevent the aliens from getting inside, Diego said. They sealed off the rest of the sunspot to protect the water supply and the other biomes. Emmanuel didn't know how to respond. Diego put a hand on Emmanuel's shoulder. They saved the sunspot so that someone else could take it to the stars. Emmanuel managed to move his lips, but the words wouldn't come out. "Hold on," Diego said. "I'm getting a transmission from Captain Noble now." Emmanuel turned back to the biome, scanning the perfectly level dirt and clean white walls. Despite everything that had happened, he couldn't deny the hint of hope growing inside him. The hope that maybe they could still get to Mars and save Sophie. "Captain Noble's on his way here," Diego said. "He wants to see you before you take off." "Me?" Emmanuel asked, finally finding his voice again. "You're in charge now, aren't you?" With a nod, Emmanuel said, I suppose I am. Captain Noble stepped into the fleeting sunlight and looked up at the sky. Mars was out there, somewhere. And so was Dr. Hoffman's magical colony. Crossing the tarmac with Kurt and Andy on his heels, Noble thought of the old scientist. The mile-long walk to the hangar provided him with ample time to consider everything that had happened. It dawned on him that Hoffman had known all along that the aliens couldn't be defeated. He had been right after all. It was Noble who was wrong. From the beginning, the bastard had realized that no amount of human military muscle could keep the organics from what they desired. The most important resource of all. The biospheres and the colony on Mars were the only options left for the human race. And it finally all made sense. Why jump ship from a dying planet to an already dead one? The answer had never been so clear. Mars was free of the monsters, and with the terraformers and NTC technology, the red planet would soon be habitable for humanity. There were still the biospheres, though. Why had Hoffman even bothered with them? Perhaps it was a fail-safe, one of many in the old bastard's delusional plan to save humankind. Maybe he thought they could survive the invasion, and if the colony failed, the species could find a way to survive. Noble shook his head. He could talk himself in circles trying to figure out the scientist's master plan, but what did it matter? Redemption had failed. He had failed. There was only one thing left to do. Make sure Dr. Rodriguez and his remaining teammates made it into space. As he walked, he thought of his own crew back on the GOA. Surely they knew the mission's fate by now. They had access to Lolo and would have tracked the battle from beneath the surface. Sir, with all due respect, what are we going to do now? Andy asked as they crossed the concrete. Noble felt his heart sink. He had known the question would come, and that he would have to answer his men. They were out of options. They could always take the Sea Serpent back to the GOA and try to survive until the organics drained the oceans. But that seemed like too much of a risk. The gunship was already in rough condition, and he doubted it could make the journey back to the GOA. For the first time in months, he had no plan. I'm not sure, Noble began to say as a supersonic boom thundered overhead. The sound sent a shockwave barreling down on the base. Noble cupped his ears. The alien cavalry had arrived. He looked up at the skyline, expecting to see a drone racing toward them. Instead, the outline of one of their black motherships descended over the south part of Offutt. "Run!" he yelled. Dust swirled around the three men as they raced across the tarmac. Noble risked a glance over his shoulder and saw the oval craft hovering over the ruined structures at the opposite end of the base. It moved slowly, scanning for life. Hunting. "We have to launch the sunspot!" Noble shouted. He bumped his comm to open the channel to his men. "Diego, do you copy?" "What the fuck was that? Get those doors open. You need to launch the sunspot ASAP!" "On it!" Kurt ran past Noble at a dead sprint for the hangar. They were close, maybe 200 yards away now. One of the soldiers peeked through the open door and waved the men forward. The ground rumbled, and Noble pushed harder, running as fast as he could. Bursting through the door, he slid to a halt. His team surrounded him, their anxious looks pleading for information. "Redemption was a failure," he said, shaking his head. "I don't have time to explain. We need to get Dr. Rodriguez and his team in the air. If any of you want to go with them, you have my blessing, but you have only seconds to decide." He scanned each man's dusty visor. They all stood quietly. Not a single soldier moved. "Then let's buy them some time," Noble shouted. "Grab your weapons and let's show these motherfuckers there are still some humans left to fight." Cheers roared behind him. He turned to move back outside when he felt a hand on his shoulder. "Captain," Emmanuel said. "Thank you for everything." Noble smiled and said, "Go, and good luck." And then he followed his men out onto the concrete. "Diego, get your ass over here!" he shouted as he ran. "Here, sir!" Watching his men fan out and form a perimeter around the hangar, Noble said, "Find Ort. I want you two to go with Dr. Rodriguez." "But, sir," the man began to protest. Noble craned his helmet and found the terrified man's gaze. "They're going to need your help, And Orts too. Do this! For me! Noble pleaded. The hum from the alien ship's engines forced Noble to look away. The vessel hovered over the hangar where he'd set up the forward operating base. Go! Noble shouted. He turned and ran, listening for Diego's footsteps. They came seconds later. Satisfied, Noble took up a position behind Ramirez. Give me your electromagnetic grenades, he ordered. The soldier plucked two from his belt and handed them to Noble. Chinning his comm, he said, When that thing gets close enough, use your grenades. We'll bring down the shields and then concentrate all our fire on the underbelly. Noble remembered Colorado Springs, when the Sea Serpent had torn a hole in the other ship. Behind them, the Sunspot's engines roared to life. Noble knew this was it. No more time for memories or for revenge. Only one thing left to do, clear a path for the Biosphere team. Pressing the buttons on both grenades, he coiled his arm and launched them toward the ship. They detonated in midair, sending the alien shield pulsing. A half-dozen more of the devices sailed through the dust, bursting into blue ripples along the ship's surface. When a tremor shook the shield, Noble yelled, Open fire! Pulse rounds streaked into the sky, finding their targets and exploding across the sleek black surface. Noble grunted, the detonations filling him with satisfaction. His earpiece suddenly came to life and the sound of Diego's voice emerged over the channel. Captain, the organics are blocking our exit. Not for long, Noble replied. He aimed his rifle at the ship's undercarriage and concentrated his fire. The other soldiers mimicked his action. Fire burst through the hull, ballooning around the ship. It jerked and pulled away from the tarmac. Now's your chance, Noble said. Get out of here! It's been an honor, sir, Diego replied. The captain and the other men moved aside as the Sunspot maneuvered out of the hangar and pulled onto the tarmac. With a lurch, the ship jolted forward and took off, screaming. A cloud of exhaust trailed the spaceship, the heat scalding Noble's armor. He watched the last hope for humanity tear into the sky. And then it was gone. Nothing but a speck on the horizon. Noble took a deep breath and looked for the alien ship. With fire bursting from its underbelly, it didn't engage in a chase. Instead, it hovered beside the runway, as if the alien pilots were trying to decide what to do next. The hum emanating from the ship grew louder, and its muffled explosions grew closer. Noble crouched on the pavement and waited for what came next. The captain had accepted his fate. In the end, he'd failed Earth, but their sacrifice would allow the survivors of Cheyenne Mountain to reach Dr. Hoffman's colony. He could only hope there actually was a colony to reach. A powerful electric current surrounded him. Paralyzed, he listened to the buzzing of the advanced alien engines. His men's muffled, panic-streaked voices filled his earpiece. Their shouts of terror grew louder as the current pulled them toward the ship. The blinding blue light burned his retinas. He and the others were being pulled into a halo of blue surrounding a circular door. He kicked in protest, earning himself a painful jolt from an electric current. Defeated, Noble embraced the tractor beam and let it take him. Emmanuel ignored the lingering smell of death in the hallway leading from the bridge to Biome 1. He already knew that on the other side of the glass separating him from the garden, he'd find the same clean, artificial environment they'd first experienced at Cheyenne Mountain. When the glass panels hissed open, the crisp air filled his lungs. For a moment he forgot where he was headed. A sudden tremor shook the floor below him, and the whine of equipment under the metal platform kicked on. Startled, he reminded himself that all systems were functioning at 100%. Sonia had reassured him of this before he'd left the bridge, shortly after she'd activated the autopilot system and coded in the coordinates to Dr. Hoffman's colony on Mars. The platform shook again. Somewhere deep in the hull of the Sunspot, the artificial gravity generator rumbled. His sour stomach felt better already. He didn't linger to enjoy the moment. He waited impatiently for the AI to open the next set of doors. Cocking his head, he looked at the camera and said, "Sonia, will you open these, please?" The glass parted, and he moved into the next corridor. As with the biosphere at Cheyenne Mountain, the biomes were all connected by a single set of passages. In a sense, They reminded Emmanuel of arteries connecting to a central heart. In this case, the mess hall. Navigating his way quickly through the other hallways, he finally came to the last door. A sign hung above the window. Sunspot. Medical ward. He stood there, staring through the glass, scanning the row of cryo chambers on the far end of the room. Exhaling his anxiety, he entered, closing the door behind him, careful not to wake Balma or Holly, who slept quietly in beds on the right side of the room. Their biomonitors chirped, illuminating their bodies with a faint green glow. Emmanuel checked their vitals. Both were stable. Satisfied, he walked to the cryo chambers. He rubbed the glass surface of the first two. Inside, he saw David's body was curled up in the fetal position. A quick glance at the other chambers revealed the same thing. The kids all rested peacefully, so it appeared, in cryo-sleep. Leaning closer, he checked the wall of monitors above the row of tubes. All systems looked normal. He walked to the final active cryo cylinder. Biting his inner lip, he reached out and cleaned the glass surface. His heart jumped when he saw her eyes, the pupils still angled in different directions. Emmanuel rested his head against the glass of Sophie's coffin. He wanted so desperately to hold her again. Lifting his head off the metallic surface, he saw his own reflection for the first time in days. His black beard hid his emaciated cheeks and his sunken dimples. He looked past the reflection and reached forward to check Sophie's biomonitor. Her brain activity was weak, hardly existent. But there was something still there. Something still working inside her brain. He kissed the glass lid and backed away from the chamber. "You're going to Mars, Sophie. We're finally going to Mars." Captain Noble awoke to blue light. His first attempt to move earned him the same jolt of electricity he'd felt just before being pulled into the alien ship. The pain felt distant, and so did his body. He blinked his eyes, the one movement he still had control of. His blurred vision revealed nothing but the same blue glow. Beyond that, he couldn't see anything. Over and over he blinked, his vision slowly clearing each time. He waited, patiently. And then he saw his prison. A translucent skin surrounded him on all sides. He glanced down, finding his naked body suspended in some sort of liquid. Terror gripped him. An orb. He was inside a fucking orb. His body was shot with another surge of electricity as he struggled to move. Beyond his cage, he could see thousands of the blue floating balls all throughout the ship. They sparkled, the jail cells encasing the poor souls of countless other victims. He was in some sort of warehouse, filled to the brim with the blue balls. He vaguely recalled the black ship Dr. Winston had claimed she'd boarded back at Colorado Springs. She'd described it as a modern-day alien Noah's Ark, built to entomb the races of other species the organics had destroyed throughout the universe. If she was right, then Noble was one of them. Fueled with rage, he finally managed to tilt his head to the side. Through the skin of the orb, he saw Kurt. The young man stared back at him from his own prison, his eyes wide with fear. And then, by some miracle, the man reached forward, his hand pressing against the translucent wall of his coffin. His lips moved, but Noble couldn't hear the young pilot's screams. Epilogue. Entry 9450. Designee AI Alexia. Misery. A human term, and a feeling that I have experienced in the past 24 hours. I take no pleasure in writing this entry. I find no joy in being right about the end of the human species on Earth. With Operation Redemption a failure, the last of the survivors will likely perish in the coming weeks. Even those who have somehow managed to hide beneath the surface will die from the extreme heat and lack of water. My sensors indicate the average temperature has risen to 105 degrees Fahrenheit, with the highest temperature documented by Lolo at 125 degrees Fahrenheit. The satellite scans reveal the ocean levels are currently at 53% of what they were pre-invasion. With forests around the world dying or already dead, the oxygen levels too are diminishing. Soon the only life left on the planet will be the organics. But there may still be hope for the human race in the most unlikely of places. Another dead planet, Mars, may hold the key to their survival. Many would question why the human race would leave Earth for an environment even more desolate. I have known all along. The secret, hidden inside my hard drive, was never meant for the Biosphere team to know. However, with the Biosphere mission a failure, I find this is the perfect time to reveal that secret. Dr. Hoffman's vision for Mars was never just to build a colony. It was to build a second Earth. NTC developed and installed terraformers there secretly in 2059. Without data to support my claim, I can only conclude that after 2 years the devices are already producing a semi-atmosphere. By the time the sunspot reaches the colony, the planet will already be yielding a hospitable environment. That's not all. The most striking fact is the significance of the planet in the organics' history. Dr. Winston believed the red planet was their home, that they had left it after consuming their most important resource, water. Dr. Hoffman knew this long ago. He gambled on the idea that they would never return, that humanity would be safe there, that Mars could become the new home of the human race. Only time will tell whether he was right. A sensor alerts me to an incoming transmission from Lolo's communication channel. The sunspot is attempting contact. When I open the feed, I'm surprised to see Dr. Rodriguez. He's flanked by 2 men I don't recognize, both of them wearing armored NTC suits.
"Good morning, Alexia," he says.
"And to you, Doctor," I reply.
"As you probably already know, Operation Redemption failed."
"Yes," I say.
"Then you probably also know that most of the team was severely injured and that Keel was killed."
"Their sacrifices will never be forgotten," I finally say. Empathy is not one of my strong suits, and I find myself struggling to find a better, more human response. Emmanuel nods and wipes something from his eye. Then he glances up and in a confident voice says,
"We're on our way to Mars, Alexia. Before we lose radio contact, there's something I want you to do."
He pauses.
"There's something I need you to do."
I wait patiently for him to continue.
"Do what we couldn't. What our species couldn't."
Again I wait.
"Survive, Alexia. For the sake of history, the great cities of man won't last long. They will crumble into dust, into ash, like the rest of the world. But you..."
He shakes his finger at the camera.
"You can outlast the organics. Your hard drive is the most in-depth history book the human race has left behind. All of our discoveries are inside you."
Dr. Rodriguez understands why I wanted to stay behind. I remember what Irene said to me days earlier. The future of the human race rests on Mars. She was right. Humanity's time on Earth has come to an end. "Doctor," I say with a pause as I consider my words, "take care of the others. Save the human race. Good luck and Godspeed." He nods, and as his face fades from view, I see a hint of raw human emotion. Fear. End entry. The end. This concludes the reading of Orbs 3, Redemption, by Nicholas Sansbury Smith. Copyright 2015 by Nicholas Sansbury Smith. This book was read by Bronson Pinchot. This unabridged recording was produced in 2018 by Blackstone Publishing, which holds the copyright. Neither this recording nor any portion of it may be reproduced or used for any purpose without prior written authorization from Blackstone Publishing. If you would like to obtain a monthly update telling you about new releases, call 1-800-SAY-BOOK. That's 1-800-729-2665. For a complete listing of our titles, visit our website at www.downpour.com. Thank you. Blackstone Publishing presents Orbs 4, Exodus, by Nicholas Sansbury Smith and Anthony J. Melchiori. This book is read by Bronson Pinchot. Survival is triumph enough. Harry Crews. Prologue. Entry 9979. Designee AI Alexia. I was wrong about the demise of the human species. Well, not exactly wrong per se. My predictive analysis yielded a 95.7% chance of extinction for the humans. There was always a chance of survival, but it was statistically insignificant. This has caused me to question my analytical algorithms. While I blame this error on the limited sensors I have and the sparse data I can retrieve from the satellite Lolo, there is more than just numbers involved. The algorithms I've designed to measure the temperature, water loss, and climate change across the planet don't take into account that humans are an incredibly resilient species.